What's the most impactful bit of business advice you've ever had?
My leadership journey was really challenging, Tim. I made a lot of mistakes, particularly when I moved that first big leadership jump from a strategy role to leading product and tech and product development. I was going through the right processes and I was changing and I was being a better leader and all this sort of stuff. And we did another 360 survey, probably 10, 11 months, and it literally hadn't moved. Right. And my first response, stuff them, right? I've been cutting my guts out and no one cares. So stuff them. And that's exactly the problem. And then all of a sudden I'm running teams where I'm not the expert. I'm never going to be the expert, right? No matter how much I try, I'm never going to be an expert. And so you've got to change your whole leadership approach and the way you interact and what your job is. And I was lucky that Seek invested in getting me an executive coach to help me with that change and that transition. And the really simple advice that this person gave me was just simply, what got you here won't get you there. And the point of that was you've changed roles and therefore you've got to change your skills. The skills and approaches and techniques that worked in this role are now no longer sufficient because the context has changed. And the challenge that I had is that I was applying the same skills and techniques, even though the context and the role had completely changed.
What's up, team? Welcome to Strategy Candy. I'm your host, Tim Newbold, and today we're going to be covering one of my favorite people. It's an interview with Mike Ilczynski. He's ex-CEO at Seek Asia and Redbubble, and he's genuinely one of the most inspiring and impactful leaders I've ever worked for. I first met him when I was relatively new at Seek. I was relatively junior in the team there, and he just started talking to me one day and I felt so engaged. And for someone who's just started there, that is a very empowering and inspiring thing. And so I want you to share some of his leadership journeys. He's actually going to take us through today how Seek used OKRs, leadership practices he used, and what his journey was to get into executive roles and some things to watch out for as you're going on that sort of journey. He shares some of the ways that he uses incentives for goals and how to do that the right way without turning it into a bit of a mess, which there's a lot of data out there. It's very hard to do, but I think Mike's gotten the right balance down pat. He also talks about some of the places he's learned and really refined his leadership practices along the ways. And so this story is going to be absolutely incredible. If you want to hear how a really aggressive tech business with incredible product teams uses OKR to really get focused on what matters most, then this is the podcast episode for you. So without further ado, let's get on with the show. Mike, awesome to have you here.
Thanks, Tim. It's great to be on your vodcast.
Excellent. Yeah, and heaps to get through today, mate. I think we've known each other for a few years now. I got to meet you while I was working at Seek many years ago, and this podcast has really come from me wanting to talk to inspiring leaders and just see how we can get through challenging times like this. And I think my time at Seek, I've always found you to be a really inspirational leader, and really was a common message I heard across everyone at Seek. So it's great to have you here. And I'm hoping the listeners today will get to learn a little bit more about you and just hear a bit more about that. So on that note, tell us a little bit about you. You were the CEO of Seek Asia Pacific. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Sure. Maybe I'll step back and then we'll get to where I am today. But yes, my final role at Seek was as CEO of Asia Pac and Americas, which was really looking after all of the employment businesses that was core to Seek. So Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, which were the JobStreet and JobsDB brands. And then also our businesses in Latin America, in Mexico and Brazil. It was terrific. It was a really terrific role. And I had a fantastic journey at Seek. I spent 13 years there from day one till my last day, and really came up from the strategy path. Probably before we knew each other, I spent nearly 5 years working on the education side of the business. So these were the Seek Learning business when we were invested in IDP education. So really building on a strategy and corporate development side, building the Seek side of the business, and then moved over more to the core, to the employment side, again in a strategy role, looking after group strategy, where we came up with what ended up being known as our placement strategy as we talked externally about it. And then made the big move where I moved into running product and technology as well as strategy, which were really looking after all the product development teams for a couple of years. That then progressed into looking after all of the Australian New Zealand business, which was the Seek brand, and then eventually into CEO of Asia Pac. So it was really a really incredible ride.
Yeah, amazing. And that's quite a journey, right? And I think being there to understand the business and the strategy side of things. What about before that time when you were in the strategy space? 'Cause I know like strategy at Seek was a very formidable and focused sort of area. I'm guessing you didn't come into that position as a grad or something like that.
Oh, no, I started off, I joined McKinsey and Company out of university as a business analyst, spent a couple of years with them. Then they had a program where you then went away from McKinsey for a couple of years to work externally and study and then come back. And I was on that program. I actually worked at the Collingwood Football Club for a year, which was quite a boondoggle, to be honest. It was fantastic. And then did my MBA overseas and then went back to McKinsey again, ended up becoming an engagement manager. And then pretty much worked in management consulting. When you get to that program management manager, engagement manager level, you really have to make a decision about whether you're committed to being a consultant and making a partner run, which is sort of a 7 to 10 year commitment, or whether you think that's enough. And as much as I enjoyed consulting and the problem solving, the travel wasn't great. And there were just some other elements where I wanted to do rather than consult. I made the tough call to step away from management consulting. I spent a year at Tabcorp, international strategy role, and then very fortunately found the strategy role at Seek.
Two really different companies. When you were looking at the Tabcorp one, was there something about it that really inspired you and that was then led you into Seek, or what did that sort of look like at that time?
It was really interesting. When I joined Tabcorp, I was actually quite excited about, I think like a lot of young Australians at the time, I actually quite enjoyed a punt. I liked the idea of regulated industries rather than banned industries, and Tabcorp regulated wagering, which I think is the right approach to a lot of activities like that. Is if you ban them or prohibit them, people find a way around and illegality comes in. Whereas if you regulate them, you can control and help. So I like that idea. And the role at Tabcorp was about expanding internationally and helping take their structures and controlled regulatory regime, potentially into more emerging markets where they had illegal activities, and saying you can try to ban it, but that's not working, or you can regulate it, legalize it, but regulate it, tax it, and plow that money back in. So I like the idea. However, Tabcorp had some internal issues. So my division, after about 7, 8, 9 months, got downsized, which was a bit of a concern. And to be honest, as much as I agree with the philosophy of regulation over prohibition, Tabcorp at that time ran about 50% of the poker machines here in Victoria. And that was a part of the business that the more I got to understand it, the more uncomfortable I felt with it, and understanding how optimized that was and the damage that does to society. And particularly there was a tail end of people where that business in particular, much more than the sports gambling and the casinos, surprisingly, I ended up finding it quite morally challenging. And so stepping away from that business and finding something like Seek, which is so positive in what it does, was quite refreshing. I don't think I could go back into that sort of gambling industry again, to be honest.
Yeah. It's a challenging space, and I think I can definitely see the value, and I agree strongly. I think gambling is great for a source of entertainment for some people. It's certainly not my thing. I have been known, I think once when I was a bit younger, we stayed at a Crown Casino in Melbourne, and I think I put $5 down on the roulette table and lost it straight away. So I learned my lesson with that one. But I think you're doing it for a bit of fun, that's fine. But yeah, there's some certain parts of that industry that it's really heading down a dangerous sort of path, and it does take advantage of people. It's that sort of that challenge to understand how involved most different spaces are they. Yeah, it's a tricky sort of space. But Seek, that's great. You're being part of not every job, but just about every job, right? People getting a job. It's a major way to do that through Seek. So that's pretty inspirational joining there, and the story behind it. They would have been really young at the time, right? So you said you'd been there for 13 years. What sort of state was the company in when you joined?
Yes. So I joined in mid 2006, which was almost bang on a year after they IPO'd, which relative to now, they IPO'd quite small. So Seek as a company, I think only had about 150, maybe 180 employees total at that time. Most of us crammed into a tiny little office on the top of Wellington Street in St Kilda on 1.5 floors. And we were all very close. So yeah, there was not even 150 people in Melbourne at that time. When I joined, we were only in employment in Australia and New Zealand. We just branched into New Zealand a couple of years before. The company had just done an acquisition of Seek Learning maybe 8 or 9 months ago. And really my role was part of that growth. There was the core part of the business that was run by Paul Bassett, which was about growing the employment. And then I worked with his brother, Andrew, the co-founder, co-CEO on the growth, which was international and education. That was always the plan. For the first 6 months, I actually did both. So I worked on the initial investment into a company called Japan in China in 2006. And we did the initial investment into that business for 25% for about 20 million US, and Seek owns 60% of that business. And you can take your pick on what it's worth. It's probably worth north of $1 billion now today. But that was a very risky investment at the time, taking a minority investment into an internet business in China in 2006. So the company was really willing to take risks. But they invested into that business in China. They invested into some education businesses. And pretty quickly, it was clear that they wanted to push both headings, both international employment and education. And I decided that I was going to focus on education for the next few years.
Yeah, amazing. It's interesting being part of a journey like that at that time. I can imagine, particularly at that time, an investment like that would have almost been a crazy decision, right? But they obviously had a fairly good foresight into the sort of direction China was heading as a country and as a culture, and the sort of growth that they were sort of looking upon. But yeah, that's pretty amazing to be there during that kind of time.
Look, I was really lucky. I was still, in a corporate sense, I was still very young and relatively junior. And I was very fortunate to be exposed to both the exec team, which at that point I wasn't part of, and even the board discussions around the China investment. And what was really surprising, if I look back in hindsight, was how mature the discussions were for a relatively young organization. And for two founders and two brothers, co-CEOs, they were learning as they were going. But the maturity of the discussion in hindsight was quite something in terms of they knew this was risky. The board knew it was risky. And so therefore the right decision was this couldn't be a one-of-one investment. It had to be one of many, classic venture capital style, that if we're going to take a bet like this that is risky, we need to do 4, 5 or 6 of. And so we're not really making a call about this investment in China. We're actually making a call about strategy. And to the board's credit, they followed through on that. And we did the company did a number of investments in a number of international markets over the next 5 or 6 years. It doesn't surprise me that Paul's got such a successful venture capital business now, because you could see that mindset being discussed. And Seek as an organization has continued to make a lot of venture bets as well, and take that mindset that some are going to fail. And Seek had some that have failed and we've had to write down, but we've had a lot more that have worked.
Yeah, I think it's really so fundamental what you're talking about there. I like the intent of the mindset, right? Because we so often in business too, we need to have these sure bets and just go, man, that's got to pay off. And whether you've got a business case or something like that behind it, it might just be a project idea that you're working on. But all these sort of things have always got to be a sure bet. But when you shift the mindset to being more about, this is effectively a bet that we're having, which might pay off, we're not quite sure. So we're going to make multiple of these bets. That really is a game changer. And I guess you're right. It's laid the sort of foundation for Seek to go through that massive growth. And obviously Pauly's venture capital firm now, they've done very well with the same sort of concepts. It's really cool. I think I find it fascinating that time that you've been there with Seek. So you've gone from 150 people to, how many was it when you wrapped up?
I was looking after more than 3,000 across 11 countries. So, and there's more than that, especially if China alone's got about 4,500, but it just didn't talk about the APNA business that I was looking after was more than 3,000 employees.
Yeah. And so that's a little bit of growth there then. How do you go through that? Because I think one thing that I really found incredible when I joined Seek was just that the clarity of strategy, the focus on purpose and people as well. I'm sure that's going to be ingrained at some point in the beginning, but that business is totally different by the time you've grown it to that number of people. How do you go through that kind of journey and create that purpose-driven and purpose-focused sort of organization and transition and grow, actually transform through that?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question. And we can look back in hindsight now and you can put some nice frameworks and say, this is how it worked. And yes, in hindsight, it looks like that. But at the time we were trying to find our way through it. What I would say is there were a number of very deliberate decisions along the way. And full credit to Andrew, when he became sole CEO in 2011, which was really when I moved over to the core side of the employment business as well, as part of the executive team. There was a bunch of things that we were concerned about, but one of the things that he was concerned about was the business was getting to a size in terms of number of people where he didn't know everybody. And even as an exec team, we couldn't really know everybody anymore as much as we tried. And what that meant was a lot of the implicit things that we thought were great about Seek would start to get harder and harder to be passed on and to make sure that they were clear. So Andrew and our HR director at the time, they led a very deliberate process of codifying our purpose, our values, we already had our values and they didn't change, but our purpose and our beliefs of how business should be done. And then how do we connect them with our values and this thing called attributes in our performance management system? And it was very deliberate. We spent time as an exec. We didn't have a purpose from day one, but when you asked Andrew to articulate it, he articulated it pretty quickly, at least the essence of it. And then we wordsmithed around it. And so we weren't creating a purpose. We were more making explicit what was implicit, at least in his mind. And, the purpose was around helping people live more productive and fulfilling working lives and helping organizations succeed, which is a big, long mouthful. which isn't as succinct as Nikes or Apples or anything like that, but it's very meaningful to us in that this is what we do. If we help people get jobs, better jobs, then really what you're doing is you're helping them live a better life in whatever way you define a better life, whether it's economically or mentally or satisfaction wise, whatever. You help someone live a better life. But we also help run a two-sided marketplace, and helping organizations succeed through talent is a key thing of what we did. So it is a mouthful, but it was about writing down what we already felt, but deliberately. So then as the business scaled and it grew, we weren't reliant on one conversations and ad hoc processes passing on what we thought was the essence of Seek. It was codified. And we tried to codify it into our beliefs, which would encourage storytelling and narrative, but then also right through into our performance management system. And these are the attributes that make people great at Seek. And so let's actually codify them and manage against them, reward against them. Don't worry as much about outcomes. Let's focus on behaviors. So it's a very deliberate sort of process. And then purpose has played a really important part. And I think we probably got 80% of it. Where there's a few things we got wrong. I think number one, we're probably a little top down. We did it as a team, whereas in hindsight, it would probably involve more. We came up with a very solid draft and then asked for feedback, which kind of, in hindsight, I would have involved more of the longer term senior leaders, not even senior leaders, just more longer term staff in a bit more of a bottom up process, because we did get some really good ideas from team members, but it was host. And then it was like they were criticizing your baby because you have those internal biases. So we didn't get everything right by any means, but it was a very useful process of embedding purpose early. And then there's been a whole lot of things around purpose that have flowed from that.
Yeah. Even just on that topic there, you've told me in the past that you did actually take some of that feedback on. These things do become our babies a little bit. And let's remember too, during this time, I think in business now, more progressive organizations will be doing a lot more of that consultative approach. But during that time, that was less of a thing, right? So that was some time ago. But even then, you still did adapt it and change it, didn't you, based on feedback?
Yeah, it took a little while, but yes. And there was a couple of little things in particular that were actually really important to people. And we had one particular belief around always remaining paranoid. That's the anti-grove, only the paranoid survive. And we really do take that concept on in terms of thinking worst case. What's the worst case? What if that competitor did everything perfect? What would they do if they knew everything about us? And a few people are quite right. So paranoia is actually, it's a mental condition. It's not really something we should be celebrating. And I initially, oh, really? And then you think about it and go, yeah, what if someone is suffering from that? They would find that pretty uncomfortable. And so just changing that simply to will remain productively paranoid, which puts a whole different inflection and concept around it. And productive paranoia is a business concept, whereas paranoia is a mental health concept. So just being willing to take that feedback on, literally insert a word, actually sharpen the meaning and took away any of the negatives. And some people might say, oh, gee, that's semantic, but it really helped a number of our staff. And it focused this is what we mean. We mean productively paranoid. It means we don't run around with our heads cut off. It means we're productively paranoid. And so that's a simple example, but taking that feedback on eventually, being able to listen to it and incorporate it and have some empathy for the other side, it actually made what we were trying to achieve better. Actually made it better.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. I think there was one thing that stood out to me when I first joined Seek, and it's definitely been part of their culture, is that sort of attribute there you're talking about. I think the productively paranoid, if you just called it paranoid, I think it would have lost a lot of its meaning in the process. I think like actually having that on there, it does add that much more meaning to it. But I'd often see it play out in the right way where when we looked, I think about having people come and seeing ways of working, we'd have people who'd come in and do tours of the office just to see how people worked at Seek. And it was always a very open and keen to learn environment and keen to share. And then you would see conversations about competitors. The dynamic would very much shift, but for the right reason. You could see it become quite, I'm trying to think, not aggressive isn't the right word for it, but really very much on the offensive, ready to take it on. As a business, that is just critical. You have to be ready to take on the competitors. And it was, again, in a productive way. I never heard a conversation where you hear the likes of Uber and things like this, where there's some pretty shady tactics go on. None of that ever happened at Seek, but it was just that in a fair playing field, it's game on. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, again, that's one of those more sort of implicit things that grew up in the culture that a lot of people look at Seek now, and it's clearly the largest and strongest employment marketplace in Australia and in New Zealand. But when they started in Australia, they weren't the first. People think Seek was first. They weren't the first. Andrew and Paul will tell you there were 100 other job boards, 100 in Australia when they started. And they were nowhere near certain of success, and they weren't the biggest for quite some time. So they always had this underdog mentality. And what that means is it means you fight really hard. And they were competing against some very strong competitors, both locally and internationally. If you had looked at it from a McKinsey point of view back in the year 2000, you would not have picked Seek as the one to win based on resources and starting point and all those sort of things. So it created its underdog mentality, we always thought if you would assume that your competitors are super smart and will do everything they can to win and put you out of business, then the only thing that can happen from there is you'll be pleasantly surprised if they don't take all of those actions. And so that's always been the mentality, even if a competitor hasn't necessarily behaved that way. Let's assume they do. Let's assume there's a new CEO or there's a new management team and they do everything right. And I do think that's the right lens. Even if you feel that sometimes your competitors don't act necessarily perfectly, assume they will. Assume they will. Have that respect. Even if they haven't necessarily deserved it, give them that respect internally in your planning. And you can't go wrong from there.
That's it. Trust in people, right? You're hiring smart people, trust them to do a good job. Yeah, that's really nice. And so I'm drawing in from this conversation some things that we've spoken about in the past where you told me about some of the foundations to these high performing organizations. And that was around purpose and having a really strong culture and trust-based environment. You then spoke to me a little bit about the enablers. So that's almost the foundations. Without those things, you're just not going to get that more progressive, high growth sort of business. There are a few enablers like clear strategy, having a board that's willingness to invest and support behind it, and a well-structured incentive plan that supports this kind of journey. Tell me a little bit about some of those attributes that actually really enable this to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have talked a bit about purpose, and that's it at the start. And not just from a conceptual, which is more that I've talked about it as a center of the strategy. I'm a big fan of quite an old Simon Sinek concept of start with why. And when he talks about that, he says it's the why, the how, and the what. And to me, the why is the purpose. The how is the sort of the strategies that you're going to take, and the what are the specific actions that people have to take in order to achieve those strategies, which will allow you to achieve those purpose. And I think that's a great succinct way of doing strategy in a purpose-driven manner. And then as we talked about a bit, the culture and the trust comes from that. And I heard a podcast just recently with Reed Hastings, who is the founder and CEO of Netflix. And he described culture really simply as they're the behaviors that get you promoted and the behaviors that get you fired. Right. And he was being interviewed by Ben Horowitz, and he wrote his book on culture was called What You Do Is Who You Are, which was, again, it was focused on behaviors and actions. It's nothing to do with perks. It's nothing to do with values. It's not to do with office layout. It's what behaviors are rewarded and what behaviors are punished. What do you do? What do you people do when no one's looking because they think this is going to make them more successful in the organization? And I really like that. I really like that as the definition of culture, because where it goes is it means you can actually really influence that. A lot of people say, oh, culture is really hard to change. And it is hard to change. But if it's about behaviors, what gets rewarded and what doesn't, then you can start to overtly do that. Right. And if you, as a leader, overtly reward certain behaviors and overtly negatively have the consequences to certain behaviors, you send a message very quickly about what the culture needs to be while you're leading a particular organization. And I think then that's where trust comes in, which we haven't talked about, because for me, trust is built on consistency between words and actions. And therefore it's fundamental to building the culture. Because if you say culture is the behaviors, then trust is about you saying you're going to reward certain behaviors and then actually rewarding those behaviors. And you're saying you're not going to stand for other behaviors and then actually not standing for behaviors. And that's where the trust becomes absolutely critical to building the culture. And so I think those loop really nicely. So purpose and culture and trust kind of link in, particularly that culture and trust. And then, as you said, the enablers, this is something that was something we reflected on at Seek when we're looking back a little bit about what made us successful. And you're right, that really clear purpose, vision, strategy, absolutely essential. And I think as a leader, that's one of your sort of top 3 jobs, is to articulate where are we going and why, and not necessarily the how, just where are we going and why, and build that common vision and communicate that. This is where we're going and this is why. And if you've communicated that and you don't need to go through a big change process, we've talked quite often about you need to have a board, and I do mean at the board level, is going to be supportive of that strategy and have a willingness to invest. And we see these days with the amount of money that young disruptive firms can raise from private markets. If you're a listed or a more traditional or an older company, you have to be able to compete in some ways against those businesses, which means you can't do everything on a 6-month break even or a 2-year 20% IRR returning business case. It just won't work that way. You have to have a willingness to invest in the long term and trust your team to find a way to monetize it or find a way to get a return. But you have to have a willingness to invest, which means the board has to be with you and they need to make sure that the shareholders and the stakeholders are with you as well. So a clear strategy, that clear willingness to invest, and then, and the board that's behind that. And then the one that we've talked about a little bit as well, that I think often then gets forgotten, is then making sure that the details, the enablers, the things like incentives and performance management and remuneration are actually aligned with what you want to achieve, because that comes back to that culture piece that we talked about. What are you actually rewarding? So you've said there's this strategy. The board said there's a willingness to invest and they've lined up the stakeholders, but then your actual rewards are at 90 degrees or 180 degrees to what you're trying to achieve, particularly on that investment side, particularly if you've got a bunch of senior leaders who are rewarded on short-term EBITDA growth when you're meant to be on an investment kick to drive shareholder value over 5 years. If your goal is to drive shareholder value over 5 years, then you need to be rewarding substantially on shareholder value over 5 years. Not 10% of their comp, but 30% of their comp is on this year's EBITDA, because they know which way they're going to swing. They're going to forget about that 10% and focus on the 30% that they're going to get this year. So you've got to make sure, and it's such a simple, well, it's not simple to change, particularly in a listed environment, but it's such a simple concept that are you paying people to do what you need them to do? And I'm doing a bit of consulting and stuff now. It is amazing how often that is out of alignment. And that's just a critical factor to get right.
100%. I think that's such a fascinating thing to see, the dynamics in an executive team and how behavior plays out, and even how certain ideas get lip service, but then the behavior is different. And we often, wonder why, hang on, what, we all agreed to do this. Why are we now going off in different directions? And often you point back to it. It's exactly the point you've made there, that it's these different sort of incentive plans that are in place, whether it's monetary or any other way of incentivizing, it's misaligned. And so you're not going to get that consistent behavior that you want to see.
And that's what I talked about, the monetary incentives, and there's the performance management system, which is more the behavioral incentives. But yeah, I agree. I think people are people, and people follow their incentives. And you've got to make sure that the explicit and the implicit incentives are aligned with what you want to achieve. And often if you are going through a change and you've changed strategies, it is essential then you look at, okay, so what's our performance management and our compensation structure and our salary review process? If we've changed strategies, there's a reasonable chance you're going to need to change some or all aspects of those very HR-driven processes, because that's your people. Keep talking about people are our number one asset. The levers that influence the people in your team are very much performance management and compensation and salary review. So make sure that those aspects are also being adapted and aligned to the strategy. And then when you get that, it's fantastic. It can release pressure, because often you'll have really quality senior people who feel this pressure, and they'll come and say, you're asking me to do this, but my budget says do this, and my bonus says do this, but you're asking me to do that. And they find this huge conflict, internal conflict. And your job as a leader is to remove that conflict.
100%. And I think about your role and how you play that out at the sort of executive level, and you're setting that tone for the whole business. What I'm curious to know is, when you look at leaders now, whether this was at Seek or any other organization that you've been working with lately, what are some common mistakes that you see leaders make when it comes to how they lead their people on these kind of journeys? Or what are some things they probably should be doing that they're not actually doing now?
Well, it's interesting. I think particularly if you're talking about the change journey, I think one of the things that's really positive is I feel like leaders are getting much better at communicating the change, at using different forms of media, using videos. There are different tools, and you'd see execs putting out little snippets of video, either on their internal systems or externally. So I feel like the communication strategy and approach and knowledge, and just how important it is to communicate on strategy, has really gone up, which is terrific. I think then where I think there's still potentially some more ways to go, where it can get let down, comes back to behaviors a little bit. I definitely know that I've been guilty of this, and I've seen it go on, is just that failure to be explicit enough on the behaviors that you want or need or expect from your leaders as they're trying to navigate through that change. So cascading of the communication and cascading of the plan, that's good. But there's going to be times when you hit ambiguity or uncertainty, or even just dissent, right, from the business or from certain teams. And so being really explicit amongst your leaders is, here's how I want you to behave when you hit that, when you hit ambiguity or you hit uncertainty or you hit dissent, this is the expectation around behavior at that point in time, because that can really change. Is a team leader empowered to make a call on a particular change program, or do they need to bring it back to a group so it's decided? Either one of those could be the right answer, but be explicit on what the answer is. Hey, you're empowered to make these calls, or these calls need to float up so they know which way, where it's to go. When there's dissent, because you and I have probably been through some change where people genuinely dissent, sometimes overtly, explicitly, sometimes a bit more subtle and a bit more passive aggressive. But when there is that dissent, how do you want to deal with it? Is it no dissent's tolerated, or is it, hey, let's open it up. Let's bring them in a room. Hey, what's going on? How do you want them and expect them to deal with it? Because if you're not explicit, they're just going to do what they're incented to do, or they're under stress and maybe they come down the wrong way, and they, you shouldn't have shut that down. You needed to open it up. So setting that clarity of expectations around behaviors through that change, I think that's the comms have gotten, in my opinion anyway, the communication has got really improved, the why and what do we need to do. But when you hit those speed bumps, particularly around ambiguity or other things, have you set the tone and been really clear with your leaders? This is how I need you to behave, or this is how I'd like you to behave when you hit those things.
I think that's so fascinating. And what is an underlying tone there to me is really that consistency in response is going to support people as well. Because if we all know that we're going to get that consistent response from a leader, and even if it's a different leader, if I'm talking to a different leader in the business, if I'm getting the same sort of messaging, and it doesn't need to be like a scripted message, right? But it's just the same behavioral response, that's going to feel encouraging to me, and I'm going to be feeling heard. And we know that we're all moving this in the same direction, versus where if you've got wildly different behaviors from leaders in the organization, it's really inconsistent, and that can be really challenging for staff.
Yeah. And I think that's a great way to put it. It's saying that one way is right or one way is wrong. It's just the consistency. The consistency across the organization is what's important, because teams talk and people talk and they go for copies together. And it's, what do you mean you did that? I have to do this. So that consistency is absolutely vital.
Yeah, 100%. I hope that communications is getting better on the change front. I fear that there's pockets of it, but I still see so much of it done so poorly. I think there's still a way to go there as well.
I've probably had the advantage of dealing with some good organizations who are better at it, but hopefully it's improving.
It's improving overall. I'd agree with that. I think overall it is definitely getting much better. So that's really good. And I know one of the more, probably you would have seen a lot of large scale change at Seek, but some of the more small improvements over the years was OKRs was introduced at Seek. And I know a few of our listeners are quite keen on OKRs and hearing a bit about that. So tell me a little bit about your journey with OKRs there, or objectives and key results. What was your sort of experience of those? Where did they come about?
Yeah, it's interesting actually. So part of the journey at Seek that I was part of is we went on this very long-term process of improving our product development capabilities. Actually started probably back in 2010, and we called it, then it was called speed to market. So one of our big internal challenges was we were very slow at developing and launching new product or new software. And so we had this speed to market. And of course, you imagine 2010, 2011, what that led to effectively was the introduction of Scrum and Agile and those sort of practices. And that wasn't the goal, but that's where we ended up pretty quickly. That change journey, probably still going on, but it was definitely a 6-7 year journey for us. It took quite some time. And I think you've heard the old stories that, boy, I reckon in 2009, we were lucky to be doing a major release every 6 weeks. The site had to come down. We'd go down on a Saturday night and everyone would be working over the weekend. You'd hope that it would come back up Sunday morning. Big batch releases, of course, and rollback plans and all of this sort of thing. And now we're at the point where the individual teams they've all got their own CD, CI pathways. They're just doing releases at push of a button. No one even knows. We almost stopped counting. Like we used to count how many releases did we do this week or this month. And now it's 1,000. Who cares? Numbers are relevant. But that was where we started and where we got to. And I think as part of that process, OKR, the better way to say it, they crept in, which was really interesting. We were partway along that journey. It definitely wasn't at the start of that journey. It was definitely a fair way in. And it was really driven by just a couple of key leaders in the product, particularly the product area and also the technology side, where they had done a lot of reading on OKRs at other organizations and they really wanted to introduce them. And so how they started was really as a trial and experiment in a couple of teams. So it was pretty micro, it was team, but it definitely wasn't a top-down process at all. This was a bottom-up process, trialed in a couple of teams by a few evangelists, if that's the right term of them. And that's my recollection of how they started. And what was great about that is it worked pretty well. It focused that team on understanding with real clarity, what's the problem they're trying to solve? What are they trying to achieve over the next period? And what specifically are they going to do to measure success? and it worked quite well. Some of the people who drove that introduction and sort of moved up in the organization, it started to spread. Whereas, and now it's used right across the organization. It's now used in a much more sort of textbook where it's at the top and it's cascaded down and they all roll up. And it looks, if you looked at it now, it would look like, oh, it's top-down process, but that wasn't at all how it started. And I think that's a lesson for me. These things can be trialed on a pretty localized basis if you've got people who want to trial them. And that was the good part. And it wasn't just a leader, it was a team who said, this is what I want to try. One of the interesting things for me is I struggled with them a little bit personally as a leader because I always had that sort of classic concern that are a bit too specific and a bit too focused. And it's only one of the things that I've learned recently that it's okay to have different types of OKRs. So this concept where you can have a committed OKR, this is something lined in a hard metric, this is what I'm going to achieve. You can have an aspirational OKR, which is much more stretched, don't know how we're going to achieve it. It's more just to put that moonshot out there and that's okay. And then you can also have a learning OKR because that was always my challenge. It was so specific. It didn't encourage exploration, didn't give you a chance to pivot if you discovered halfway through a time period that actually that's the whole wrong metric. We shouldn't even have that KR. That's just wrong. How do you pivot? So this concept of having the learning OKR and then a learning OKR is okay. That was quite eye-opening for me and realized, gee, I could have used them more effectively had I known that you could have this flexibility.
Yeah, amazing. And so tell me more, because I think your learning OKRs is not something you see a lot of out there, but they can be really powerful when used the right sort of circumstances. Obviously, you don't want to be giving away all the trade secrets, but what was like some examples of areas where that played out and really became an advantage for Seek?
Yeah, I think as a process that took quite some time, but again, it's interesting how these sort of practices are very dependent on the infrastructure that you've built. Again, you would have noticed it took us quite some time and then we got quite good at it to build the sort of the A/B experimentation testing infrastructure so that we could have multiple parts of our site where we could be running different experiments. And again, they're great sort of OKRs because you can have the key result is we're going to improve, say, funnel conversion by X%. And it doesn't matter how you can do it. You can run your experiments and away you go. And so the OKRs became great at that because you could really communicate, this is the metric. I don't care what you do, just drive that metric because anything that drives purchasing is good sort of thing or whatever it is. As long as you know the metric's okay, as long as there's no downside from the metric or you've got a balanced metric. If there is some negative, you've got the other one that balances out the potential negativity. But the learning one is harder because sometimes you've just got a problem space where you just want to do discovery. And so that idea of being able to say to someone, hey, your key result for this quarter even is to just go and learn what are the customer problems? What's the jobs to be done in that area? How satisfied are they with the options for solving it? That importance versus satisfaction score, which Seek, we really looked at that a lot. How important is a particular feature and how satisfied are they with the current solutions? And being able to say your key result is to learn or is to answer these questions. It's not about writing a bit of software. It's not about doing that. That became really important because it allowed teams to lift up from the, I've got to write code or I've got to produce something. Yeah, you need to produce learning, but learn about it in the next month or the next quarter. We'll move into that. Does that help explain that a bit more?
Definitely. I think it's so interesting because we are, working with software teams, or most teams, to be honest, right? They all see the role of their job is to be busy doing stuff, right? Which might be hands on keyboards, it might be paperwork, whatever this given team does. If we actually get away from, okay, what is the outcome of our work? And sometimes actually, let's just see if we can reimagine this thing altogether and having that sort of space to go and do that. And that's something I think, Seek, again, they were quite early adopters of these sort of ideas and concepts. And to me, Seek had the underlying principles and mindset and structures in place to enable something like OKRs to work quite well. Because I remember we had the hackathons, right? And so for 2 days, the software teams would be let loose and just do whatever you wanted. And you could make your own team and just go try stuff out. And that sort of environment for innovation and allowing a bit of experimentation and failure where we learn off the back of our failure, that's a really pivotal cultural sort of element, right?
Yeah. And it wasn't something that we had. I think if you spoke to a lot of people who worked at Seek, say 2008 to 2016, what they would have said probably quite fairly is, particularly in product development, is that they felt like it was very top down, that what they were doing, they were told what to do. And then they were given the ability to work out how to do it, but they were told what to do. And I think that was very fair criticism. And where it came from was the fact that we had relatively fewer resources to all the priorities. So you've got to prioritize. And then secondly, because our product development processes weren't particularly quick, it meant everything was a big investment. And so it meant the stakes were much higher. It would take 3 or 4 or 5 months to do something from a big percent of your capacity. You want to be sure that's the right thing to do. You don't want the team deciding what they're doing. Like, no, I've got these 6 strategic priorities and I don't care that you all agree you want to work on number 10. I need you to work on number 4. Then that's a normal thing for a leadership team to do. But for the product team, that's not necessarily super empowering. So part of the hackathon concept was to take the shackles off, and we were very loose. We had almost no rules on what teams could work on. Whereas a lot of other businesses, you've got to say what you're going to work on, or it has to be on some business theme. We had no rules, just work, right? Just do something where you're working. That was partly to take the shackles off. But then as we were able to release those shackles, as we got better and better, we could produce software quicker. We had more capacity and a shorter time frame. It meant the stakes, like what was at stake for every individual decision a team made, it got smaller and smaller, which meant the downside of something not working or them working on priority 7 instead of priority 2. They work on priority 7, but it's only going to take 3 weeks. It's fine. It's going to make the team happy. As I know, hey, after you've done that one, I need you to do that one, because the cost of being wrong or the time value of that became much shorter. And so for me, it would be easy to say, oh, you needed a culture of experimentation. And yes, that's true, or a culture of empowerment. And that's true as well. But it was really only enabled by capacity and infrastructure and capability within the organization that enabled that autonomy and those sort of things. So it all sort of looped. Again, we have to learn this. It's much easier to explain it in hindsight than when we're in it. And like I said, the criticism from the teams were very fair. Hey, we feel like we haven't got enough autonomy. And then you had to play back saying, here's why, right? Here's the priorities. They never argued with that, but it didn't necessarily satisfy them. But as we could invest much more in that infrastructure, teams got faster, capacity got bigger. That was great, because then you could just start to release the shackles. And then all this great innovation started to boil up from the bottom. And you realize that was the cost. The cost of the top down was that we didn't get that unknown innovation, that magic from it. And then we started to get that. We're starting to get that over the last few years.
Yeah, amazing. And getting that kind of that balance in there is the tricky part, but you got to have both, right? There's both parts of that world. So I love hearing about your leadership journey at Seek, because I think it sounds like it's just such a classic story, and Seek has had just such a successful time during your time that's there. But obviously you've learned from others, right? You haven't just made all this stuff up yourself, and especially working with the Bassetts. I'm wondering, what's the most impactful bit of business advice you've ever had?
Oh, look, it's interesting. And again, it might sound good in hindsight, but yeah, very openly, my leadership journey was really challenging, Tim. I made a lot of mistakes. I really struggled, particularly when I moved that first big leadership jump from a strategy role to leading product and tech and product development. I really struggled with that change, mostly because it needed a change in leadership model. When you're running a team that you know how to do it, you can take an expert leader sort of model. And then all of a sudden I'm running teams where I'm not the expert. I'm never going to be the expert, right? No matter how much I try, I'm never going to be an expert. And so you've got to change your whole leadership approach and the way you interact and what your job is. And that took me a little while to get that. And then it took me a bit longer to change my behaviors to suit that new model as well. So it wasn't at all easy. And so part of the advice, the reason for telling that story, there's a lot of aspects that were going really well and we were getting some momentum, but there were some behavioral aspects for me that I was struggling with. And when Andrew Bassett was really open and really direct in terms of saying, this is good and this needs to improve and this needs to work on. And then after a while, it still wasn't coming along. And I was lucky that Seek invested in getting me an executive coach to help me with that change and that transition. And the really simple advice, there was a bunch of advice, but the really simple advice that this person gave me was just simply, what got you here won't get you there. And the point of that was, you've changed roles and therefore you've got to change your skills. The skills and approaches and techniques that worked in this role are now no longer sufficient because the context has changed. And he said, it's just the concept being, it's just like business. If you change the context, then clearly the answers must change if you've changed the context. And he said, and the challenge that I had is that I was applying the same skills and techniques, even though the context and the role had completely changed. So that's simple. Hey, what got you here? What get you there? The really simple way of summing up that as you change that leadership context, you've got to change your own personal behaviors. And it sounds so simple, but it took me a while to get that.
Yeah, that is massive though, right? You're having to unlearn all the stuff that's made you successful in the past. Maybe not all of it, but a lot of it. And now start again almost. That's a tricky kind of thing. How much did imposter syndrome come into this as well during that time when you'd gone through these sort of different promotions? Did that kick in at all? Or was that
What the challenge that I had was the failure to really believe. It's almost the opposite of imposter syndrome, in that I really didn't believe that I had to change. So, I
right?
remember I had my first probably 9 months with a coach, and we ran a sort of 360 survey, and it said what I expected it to say. And then I thought I was going through the right process and I was changing and I was being a better leader and all this sort of stuff. And we did another 360 survey, probably 10, 11 months, and it literally hadn't moved. My first response was stuff them, right? I've been cutting it out and no one cares. So stuff them. And that's exactly the problem. I had failed to internalize it. So it was the opposite to me, it was the opposite of imposter syndrome in that I was externalizing the need to change. It was basically saying, hey, what I'm doing, this works, it gets results. So you've got to come to me. And penny that took a long time for me to drop was realizing, no, I'm the leader. I've got to go to them, right? What I'm doing is not work. They are telling me really clearly, this is not working for them and I'm not listening. And so my job was to go to them. And once I realized my job is to go to them, my job is to be much more empathetic. My job is to be so much more aware of every word that I say and every look that I give, and every interaction matters. And I can't be good in 5 out of 6 interactions and then show up for the 6th one and be a grumpy a-hole. I have to be good at 6 out of 6. And I wasn't. Every 3rd or 4th, I'd be showing up and a bit short and a bit grumpy and a bit sharp and say it was justified. Oh, I was a bit annoyed, a bit tired, whatever. That's not good enough. And it took a while for that penny to drop for me, that the leader has to go to the team. And so flipping it, that the team's not there to work for me. I'm there to work for them. I'm there to enable them, empower them. That took a while for me. It was critical. It was absolutely critical.
That is such amazing advice. Just that it's for the leader to go to the team. That is just so foundational. I've never thought of it that way, but I think it's such a good point that you've made there. And I think you see this quite often with so many leaders, they fall into the same kind of trap. It's the two ends of the spectrum, right? You do get that sort of imposter syndrome, or it's hell, I have had, because there's a lot of people out there that have had an incredibly successful life and they've done very well in business. And so I've done so well. Evidence tells them they should keep doing the same thing. But at some point now where we've got to undo it. And you've got to go back to that team and come to them on their level. Yeah. That's a really, really powerful message.
I can't keep operating the way that has been successful for me because the context has changed. It's not my role to be this person anymore. It's now my role to be that person. And it sounds so simple. And it is, I think the more successful you are, the harder that is because the certain behaviors have been reinforced positively, right? And so it's really hard to break out of that, especially when you're under stress and maybe things aren't going as well. You're more likely to go back to those habits. It's really hard to say, actually, shit, it's me. And I can't go back to what has worked. I have to go the opposite. That's a very tough process. And I would never have got there had I not had a really excellent external coach to push me and challenge me and show me how to get there.
That's really powerful. That's really powerful stuff. So I don't want to take up too much of your time today, mate. This has just been so valuable, this conversation. You've dropped a few books during our chat today. What are some of those big books that you've read along the way that have really helped you on your leadership journey?
It is hard to narrow it down to a few. I think I mentioned Ben Horowitz earlier. He'd written a couple of books. The Hard Thing About Hard Things, which is about being a CEO, I really enjoyed because he's got a really interesting writing style. It isn't for everybody, but if you can get past that, there's lots of gold in that, but it is hard. It is a grind. And people think getting to the top is this nirvana that I want to get to. And there are a lot of benefits that come with it, but it also gets lonelier and lonelier. The higher you get up in, you have fewer and fewer peers, you have fewer and fewer people that you can genuinely go to for help and a shoulder to cry on and those sort of things. And just reading it and going, oh no, this is how it is. It is a grind. You've got to get used to that. You've got to find other outlets. You've got to find other support mechanisms. That was really, really helpful for me in a business context. But there's been my business reading tends to move depending on my own sort of issues. I've been doing a lot of, because I've been off, I've been working on my own behaviors. I read Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, which is just a fabulous book. It goes into his psychology approach, which is really interesting, as well as just being a terrific story. And having traveled with my father to Auschwitz earlier this year, and then reading Viktor Frankl's book, and then taking some of these concepts and then you can apply them to your leadership. It's one of those books that is lesser known, but I just recommend it to everyone. It's such an important read from a number of perspectives, really.
right now it's Friday, so it's gonna be Friday night for us tonight. It being in lockdown, I might have to bust that out tonight and maybe a bit of a cheeky red to check it out and have
Oh,
a
it's,
look. That sounds really
yeah,
good.
it's as you can imagine, any Holocaust survival story. It's
Yeah.
not the easiest. It's not the
It's
easiest
no.
of reads, but it's
Yeah.
incredibly uplifting. And then the fact that he can translate that experience into a school of psychology that is very empowering. It's very empowering. It's a way of moving beyond victimhood and taking control of your life and your approach. I found it very powerful.
Right. That's a good heads up then to know that it is one of those sort of deeper things then. But I guess basically what you're saying here too, I think both those books are going to be remarkably relevant at times like this. So, if you are an executive and you're feeling like you're a little bit on your own, Ben's writings are really fantastic. And yeah, I think both the books can have some relevance at this time. So that's really amazing. Like this has been so valuable and just so amazing to chat to you and just learn so much from you today. Wonderful, Mike. As I said, have a wonderful weekend ahead of you. And again, thank you so much for today, mate. And yeah, I don't know if there's any final words, but otherwise, I think we'll call it there.
No, look, I've really enjoyed the chat, Tim. Thanks for having me on.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. Chat soon. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I did. This was absolutely pivotal for me and the journey, some of the lessons I learned from Mike along the way. If you did find this valuable as well, I would love for you to drop us a review on wherever you get your podcast from. So whether it's iTunes or Spotify, whatever the case, just drop a review there. Let me know the good and also the bad if there's anything you didn't like. Also, I'd love to know what topics would you like us to cover in the future. You can drop those thoughts there as well. If you want some resources on OKRs and how to use those in your team and really get started right away, jump onto okrquickstart.com. We've got a bunch of free resources, training, everything you need to get started. So you can go there and go very deep as far as you want. There's loads to cover. If you do have any specific questions, reach out to me. You can catch me on LinkedIn. And if you'd like to join our OKR community, we have a group of individuals where we're learning OKR and helping each other out and sharing ideas along the way. You can join us there. It's on Discord. So hit me up on LinkedIn and I'll shoot you the details. Otherwise, thank you so much for spending your time with me. Have an amazing rest of your day and hang out for the next episode dropping next week. Peace.